Welcome back to the class. Let us resume our discussion on the kind of criticisms against globalization. So, this is the third session in this particular week, and we had two sessions on this very important and influential work titled The Empire by Michel Hart and Antonio Negri, considered to be an extremely influential work that have inspired quite a lot of people and been widely considered as the manifesto of anti-globalization struggles. So, in this class, I want to introduce you to another very important and influential scholar, an economist by name Joseph Stiglitz, who once was a supporter of very neoliberal economic policies and later changed his opinion and turned out to be a very bitter critic of globalization, especially the neoliberal globalization. And he became a very important advocate against the policies of IMF and World Bank, and then in general the kind of a capitalist corporations and or that of the market economy. And he has been quite influential in providing a very solid critique against the neoliberal globalization. So, in this particular session, we are going to make some familiar themes about his book titled The Globalization and Its Discontents. So, Joseph Stiglitz is an American economist, public policy analyst, and a professor at Columbia University. And more than a mere economist, he is considered to be a very important public intellectual, considered to be extremely influential in terms of forming public opinion, who has the ability to reach out beyond the confines of academia, who is able to shape opinion in the popular sphere about certain issues. So, he has been considered to be quite influential, and he is a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank, and is a former member of the chairman of US President's Council of Economic Advisors. So, he is not somebody who has been confined to his role as a university professor, but had quite a lot of reach beyond the academia as well, and author of several books. And Globalization and Its Discontents is one of the very popular, very important books that he has written, and we are going to look into those arguments. And he also published another book, Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited, published in 2017. In this book, he kind of looks at his arguments in the light of Donald Trump assuming the president's office in the United States. So, he is bringing in quite a lot of more recent changes that have happened in the US with the coming of Donald Trump. But we will stick to the old book, the 2002 book, where he puts forward the very important and substantive arguments against a kind of a reckless neoliberal globalization. So, what I am going to give you is a very brief summary of the book. It is quite difficult to summarize the whole book in a very short period of time. So, I would urge you, to those who are interested, to read the original. It is available. It is one of the very popular books on globalization. So, it is available. So, you can read the copy, but here we will only try to get some idea about his major critiques or points of criticism against the way in which globalization is being handled. So, the main tenet of the book is this: pro-globalization policies have the potential of doing a lot of good if undertaken properly and if they incorporate the characteristics of each individual country. Countries should embrace globalization on their own terms, taking into account their own history, culture and traditions. And by reading this very paragraph itself, it becomes clear that he is not somebody who is against globalization. Okay? And I do not think that any economists will be a kind of a completely anti-globalization. They will be against the very idea of globalization. They know that it's an inevitable part of late capitalism. It's an inevitable inevitable product of this world era. But he also thinks that globalization can be quite profitable. It can be beneficial to quite a lot of countries. But he argues that a kind of, you need to have a very complex ways of implementing that, and you can't have a straitjacket approach that one shape fits for all kind of argument. That will not work, because if it is undertaken properly and if they incorporate the characteristics of each individual country by respecting their own terms, taking into account their own history, culture and tradition, and this is something extremely important. And how do whether the global economic institutions like IMF or World Bank, whether will they be able to look into these complications, because looking into history, culture and traditions, they're all considered to be more complications, unnecessary deviations. They are kind of widely considered as unnecessary and irrelevant irritants in the typical economic policy circles, because they think that they are less significant and a purely technical managerial understanding of economics is sufficient. And that is why quite a lot of policies take shape. That's how quite a lot of policies take shape. But Stiglitz, a very important economist, is arguing that you need to really look into history, culture and traditions. However, poorly designed policies are likely to be costly. They will increase instability, make countries more vulnerable to external shock, reduce growth and increase poverty. So, this is the major argument, that the policies of globalization, the way in which they are implemented is something extremely important, and need to pay close attention to that. The problem, according to Stiglitz, is that globalization has not been pushed carefully or fairly. On the contrary, liberalization policies have been implemented too fast, in the wrong order, and often using inadequate or plainly wrong economic analysis. So, it's a very important self-criticism or criticism leveled against his fellow economists, because economists who are sitting in these important institutions of economic institutions, international economic institutions. So, he's arguing that they quite often use inadequate or plainly or wrong economic analysis, and this liberalization policy have been implemented too fast. These bodies, especially World Bank and IMF, have been exerting quite a lot of pressure on a host of countries to adapt very radical restructuring of their economy, because they believe that that is the way in which the country's economy needs to be reformulated. What we generally understand it as a kind of a neoliberal economic turn, and I'll just explain what it means in the next slide. So, as a consequence, he argues that we now face terrible results, including increase in destitution and social conflict and generalized frustration. So, his argument that quite a lot of countries underwent economic depression during 1990s, much later in 2009. Then there was a recession in 2008. Then you had this East Asian crisis, and a host of these reasons he argue, or the relative poverty and deprivation of many countries, he argues is a result of this wrong implementation of economic policies. And he very squarely put the blame on the doorsteps of these three important factors. The main culprits, he used the same word, culprits, are the IMF and its market fundamentalists. So he characterizes IMF as the market fundamentalists. Okay, so who very strongly believe that the market has its own its own way of getting things done, and you don't really need to interfere in the market. Market has its own logic. Market will decide whatever market decides is good for the economy. Okay, and we know that this particular debate has very long history. Whether can we have a completely laissez-faire approach? Can we simply take our hand from the market and allow market to have its own run, or should the state intervene? Or if the state has to intervene, to what extent? And if the market is allowed to have its own run, what would be the consequences on different sections of population? So he characterizes IMF as the market fundamentalists, and he also blames the Washington Consensus and the US Treasury as the three important culprits. Now, what is Washington Consensus? I have a slide which lists around 10 very important policy decisions that Washington Consensus in 1989 arrived at. So, Washington Consensus refers to a set of free market economic policies supported by prominent financial institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank and US Treasury in 1989. So, I am not going into the details of all the 10. We'll just read out and maybe touch upon the last couple of things, because that's where they talk about liberalization, privatization and deregulation. So, they are all important economic policies aimed at the liberalization of economy, opening up of the border, or opening up of the economy, inviting or encouraging private players to come in, and of course that of disinvestment. The state, and very strong argument that the state must withdraw from quite a lot of activities, and private players must be allowed to play very actively. So, low government borrowing. The idea was to discourage developing economies from having high fiscal deficit related to their GDP. Diversion of public spending from subsidies to important long-term growth supporting sectors like primary education, primary healthcare and infrastructure. And we know that neoliberal economies are infamous for their opposition to these subsidies. And the third point is implementing tax reform policies to broaden the tax base and adopt moderate marginal tax rates. And the fourth point is selecting interest rates that are determined by the market. These interest rates should be positive after taking inflation into account. Fifth point is encouraging competitive exchange rates through freely floating currency exchange, so that there is no restriction of foreign investment to come into picture. Adoption of free trade policy, something very contentious, very important. This would result in the liberalization of imports, removing trade barriers such as tariffs and quotas. And we know that this particular theme is very current in the contemporary era. We are, many countries, including USA or European countries and India, they are thinking that we have gone too much in terms of this liberalization, and they are, putting more and more import trade tariffs and quotas, and especially against the Chinese products. And in India also we are talking about being more self-reliant, we are talking about Atmanirbhar. So we are seeing the kind of a backlash of this particular kind of policies. Then relaxing rules on foreign direct investment, okay, to the extent to which foreign capital can be allowed, and then to be allowed to invest in your own country, to take over your own domestic industries and business groups and other things. And one of the very important points, the privatization of state enterprises. Typically, in developing countries, these industries include railways, oil and gas. So, the state wants to sell off quite a lot of its own public enterprises, so that it withdraws more and more from such kind of economic activities and allow private players to play. And the eradication of regulations and policies that restrict competition or add unnecessary barriers to entry, and development of property rights. So, these 10 points, if you summarize, that's why I thought I will put all these them in a slide, though it looks very clumsy. So, these are some of the very important features adopted in the Washington Consensus, but they also are some of the most important features of a neoliberal economic policy. So, now coming back to this particular book, Globalization and its Discontents. Most of this book is devoted to criticize the IMF for its failure in 3 main areas. One is crisis management, the East Asian crisis, and you know that in the East Asian countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, and all of them experienced a very severe economic crisis in the late 2000s, and there was a fear that this East Asian economic crisis might spill over to rest of the world, but that did not really happen to that extent it was feared. Then the development of poorer countries, transition from planned to market economies, example the problem with the Russia. So, these are the 3 areas that Stiglitz argues that IMF really failed. More generally, the IMF is accused of having undergone a great mutation from Keynes created to fight global depression to the cockpit of market fundamentalism and the Washington Consensus. So, Stiglitz is very, very unkind in his criticism against, IMF, and many times many reviewers of the book have opined that it turned out to be quite bitter, because he targets some officials personally, he targets the intention of the officials, he targets the very integrity of the officials, saying that they are mostly from the richer countries, and they are always loyal to their parochial interest and that of their countries rather than the larger interest of the rest of the world. But he is very, very acerbic in his criticisms against IMF. In this regard, Stiglitz stresses that IES is this institutions of international economic institutions, including World Bank and IMF and others, need to have a more open mindset rather than rely on a unique model and refrain from prescribing one size fits for all policies that might be harmful. So, this is his recurring theme, that an implementation of a Washington Consensus, that as if that is a silver bullet, as if that is the panacea for all economic problems across the world, and then implementing these set of regulations, okay, without looking into the complexities, historical complexities and cultural and local things, it would be disastrous. The allegation is that by prescribing seemingly pro-market policies that, however, exacerbate the risk of systemic shocks, that is early capital account opening, premature domestic financial liberalization, and disregard the need for social safety nets, the Washington Consensus is undermining globalization. So, this is his overall the argument that you are actually being insensitive to this kind of local conditions. You are pushing these agendas, oblivious to its very negative consequences on a host of local population and other sections of the population. And these these initiatives are really creating quite a lot of negative consequences. And these negative consequences in terms of economic suffering of substantial section of population, the economic decline of indigenous economic enterprises and organizations, and thereby a kind of increased sentiment against the very idea of globalization. Since, according to Stiglitz, they do not cater for the benefit of globalization to be shared, and on the contrary produce growing inequality, such policies may have become the most serious obstacle to expand free trade, the extent of markets, and accordingly reap larger gains of the world. So, while to certain extent we can say that these policies of liberalization and privatization have really increased the kind of international trade and opened up the economic globalization, Stiglitz would argue that a mishandling of the same have resulted in quite a lot of negative consequences, and that must have undermined the very spirit of globalization by turning vast section of populations against that. He identifies the three pillars of Washington Consensus, that is fiscal austerity related to the state spending less and less money for the internal welfare activities and subsidy and other thing, privatization, okay, allowing more and more private players to come into very important areas like, say, for example, education or health or military or railway or other things. We know that even in India we are passing through that kind of a transition. India had a very strong public sector. India till 1990, India followed quite a lot of socialistic oriented economic policy, where the state and public sector played very important role. And with the economic restructuring of 1990s by Manmohan Singh and others, so we are also started a new process of privatization, fiscal austerity and market liberalization, and contends that the problem was that many of these policies became ends in themselves rather than means to more equitable and sustainable growth. So, he argues that this whole idea of equitable growth, a growth for almost everybody, it is not that a growth that increase the divide between rich and the poor. It's not that the growth that only benefits a few at the cost of a large section of population. It's a more equitable growth and a sustainable growth. So, these two very important lessons have been forgotten, or they have been sidelined according to this, Joseph Stiglitz. Liberalization is carried out without putting it in proper context and lacking the proper institutional setup. So, to what extent do you liberalize your economy? How do you have you really thought about what happens to your farmers, for example, if you open up your economy when other countries can dump their agricultural products into your country, and thereby reducing the price of your own products absolutely low. So, what are the kind of steps taken? What are the kind of initiatives taken? So, these are all extremely important points according to Stiglitz. Sequencing of reform is crucial. Okay, so economic reform, as he say, cannot be implemented all on a sudden. It cannot be pushed, in a very aggressive manner. It has to be properly planned, else liberalization will not be successful. In fact, institution building must precede or at least accompany liberalization, but also there must be a social consensus in the nation that is undertaking such a transformation. And the social consensus may only rest on the respect for a social contract whereby benefits will be widely shared. So, here Stiglitz is really talking about some of the very core ideas of an egalitarian society. And a democratic society, a society where every section of population is taken into confidence when a new initiative is taken, and every institutional mechanism is in place so that these new economic policies will be beneficial to everyone. Okay, so he promises, or he foresees a kind of a democratic spirit behind the implementation of these things, and then he accuses these international economic institutions for paying scant regard to these important arguments. And unfortunately, the Washington Consensus did not worry about the social contract. The social contract is a contract between the state and the citizen. Okay, the citizen respects the state. Citizen performs his or her obligations dutifully on the belief, on the contract that the state is there to take care of their basic necessities. So, in an era of neoliberal economy, where the state's role has been contrasted to a large extent, many a time large number of population are at the mercy of the market, and we know that the markets can be really ruthless. Market has a very less kind of sentiment towards the questions of discrimination or inequality or poverty or lack of access of resources. So, these are not the kind of terms or things that the market really would like to think. Market would only try to think about profit maximization. So, he says that the state has to have that kind of a political commitment to its own citizens. That is, the idea that the growth by itself will heal the problems it initially causes. Okay, so he argues that this Washington Consensus does not worry about the social contract, rather it believes in the trickle-down economics. So, what is the trickle-down economics? The trickle-down economics believes that you can't really wait for every section of the people to improve, or your economic policies should not really target at the lowest rung. Rather, you must encourage, or you must enforce a rapid economic growth, so that once a country progresses economically, or its GDP increases, or there is a substantial section of population, at least the elites improve gradually, its benefits will trickle down, and so that even the last person will be benefited. Okay, so this is a policy that is by default not aimed at the poorest of the poor, but it's aimed at the top. It's aimed at the most affluent section, most important section, the section who is capable of sprucing up the growth rate, with the belief that these economic growth will bring in benefits, and this benefits will trickle down, just like water trickles down maybe along with soil, so that after some time it reaches the bottom. But we know that this whole trickle-down economics or trickle-down effect has been widely questioned. It has been widely questioned. There is a huge amount of literature which really questions this particular rationale, that you don't worry about the poor will ultimately benefit because of the economic growth. and there have been studies which have conclusively shown that there is kind of hardly any relation between the poor being improving their situation and that of the high economic growth, because inequality can be an extremely important phenomenon. To whom are these IEs accountable, international economic institutions accountable? They are controlled by officials from the developed nations representing specific interests even within their own countries. Finance ministers and central bank governors or IMF, World Bank, trade ministers for the WTO, World Trade Organization. This leads Stiglitz to conclude that behind the mindset imposing questionable Washington consensus policies is the fact that the IEIs cater for particular interests associated with a parochial perspective. So, this is the point that I mentioned earlier. So, he thinks that rather than very sound rational economic policies, quite a lot of very non-rational parochial interest, self-interest of these members of World Bank, of other things, they really play very, very pivotal role in deciding the policies of World Bank and others. As such, the international economic institutions lack representation of and accountability to groups other than the financial community and the business commerce community of the developed countries. So, he is really questioning their larger integrity itself, their larger politics itself, saying that they may not have any kind of larger political commitment to the underdeveloped nations or developing nations, but their ultimate aims are already regulated and controlled by the very, very parochial interests. So, he argues that globalization calls for global institutions addressing global externalities. According to Stiglitz, major changes are needed in the governance and voting rights of these institutions. Also, more openness and transparency is needed as secrecy undercuts democracy and accountability. So, as I mentioned, his book is a very, very strong critique of the way in which these institutions, especially World Bank and IMF, works. Stiglitz makes two proposals. One directly to reshape the IMF, the other to make more broadly reforms the international financial system. He believes that voices must be raised to address the legitimate concerns of those who have expressed discontent with globalization. If we are to make globalization work for the billions of people for whom it has not, if we are to make globalization with a human face to succeed. So, this is the kind of argument that Joseph Stiglitz put forward, that he is arguing very passionately for a more democratic process, a kind of a more equitable distribution of resources to every nation. He questions the dominance of the developed nations and their economic and political agenda at these institutions of international economic institutions. So he really asked for a very radical reform within these IMF and also within the international financial system. So, this is a very broad overview of Stiglitz, especially his work, globalization and its discontents. I have not gone into each of the chapters. There is a chapter on Russia, there is a chapter on different other themes, but this is the overall kind of broader argument. So, I hope you would have got some picture, some idea about Stiglitz's criticism. A person who was once served as a vice president of World Bank, who later turned out to be a bitter critic of these institutions. So, let us stop here and we'll meet you for the next class. Thank you.